There are film shoots that today would be completely prohibited, cancelled, and would cause a global scandal. I am not exaggerating in the slightest. I am talking about empirical facts. Shoots where there was a civil war with serious injuries, real assassination attempts, lion attacks that left more than 70 wounded on set, an actor shooting at extras and the director threatening to kill him. But don't worry, that is only the beginning. After this, you will never see your favorite movies the same way again. The craziest part is that we aren't talking about accidents. We are talking about productions that were a delusion from the start. Directors who decided to film in the middle of a real war, using authentic human corpses bought from grave robbers to decorate the set, while the protagonist suffered a heart attack and the director threatened to shoot himself if he couldn't finish his masterpiece. Get ready, because today you are going to see what a tormented genius is capable of doing just to bring his masterpiece to life. There is nothing above this. Roar 1981 is by far the most dangerous film shoot in history. It was promoted with a terrifying slogan: "No animals were harmed in this movie, 70 people were." It all started when producer Noel Marshall and his wife, Tippi Hedren, visited Africa in 1969. After seeing an abandoned house occupied by lions, they decided to film a movie to raise awareness about their protection. When they tried to rent trained animals in Hollywood, the experts were blunt. It was impossible. The couple's solution was to raise their own lions. They started with one cub in their house and ended up on a ranch in California with 150 large felines without any training or security measures. What was supposed to be a 6-month shoot turned into an 11-year ordeal. Marshall didn't want trained animals. He wanted natural behavior. The problem is that the natural behavior of a 200-kilogram lion is to hunt. It is a miracle there were no deaths, but the injuries were so constant and so brutal that it seems like a joke. Jan de Bont, the cinematographer, was attacked by a lion that literally scalped him. He received 220 stitches and, after recovering, returned to the set to finish the film. Melanie Griffith, Tippi's daughter, suffered an attack from behind. The claws tore her cheek and forehead. That take is in the movie. The terror on her face is real. She needed 50 stitches and reconstructive surgery. Noel Marshall himself was bitten more than 11 times. On one occasion, a lion drove its fangs through his hand, and he refused to go to the hospital. He developed gangrene so severe, they were on the verge of amputating his arm. Tippi Hedren had no better luck. An elephant broke her ankle, and, after bites to her neck, a staph infection nearly cost her a leg. As if the lions weren't enough, the shoot suffered catastrophes worthy of a curse. In 1978, a massive flood broke a dam, destroyed the sets, killed several lions, and lost much of the footage. Shortly after, a forest fire hit the area, and Marshall had to evacuate the felines while flames surrounded the ranch. These disasters stretched the shoot from 5 to 11 years. How was this allowed? Marshall and Hedren invested their fortune, $17 million, giving them total control without supervision. By filming on their private ranch, they operated away from the unions. Marshall prohibited trainers under the philosophy that the animals should act out of love. Every time a lion injured someone, Marshall applied a cult-like logic. The animal is only playing, or you projected fear. The film was an absolute failure. Marshall and Hedren divorced, and Tippi admitted years later that Roar was the biggest stupidity of her life, deeply regretting having put her children's lives at risk for an artistic delusion. Tippi dedicated the rest of her life to rescuing felines at her Shambhala Preserve Foundation, but strictly forbade humans from having direct contact with them. During the filming of The Shining, Stanley Kubrick wasn't just looking for technical perfection, he crossed an absolutely unacceptable ethical line. Kubrick decided that for Wendy Torrance's fear to be real, actress Shelley Duvall had to live through an authentic ordeal. He didn't want a performance, he wanted a documented nervous breakdown. During the 13 months of filming, Kubrick isolated Duvall completely. He strictly forbade the crew from sympathizing with her. No one could encourage her, congratulate her, or be kind. She had to feel alone, rejected, and under constant attack. The director humiliated her in front of everyone, screaming that she was wasting everyone's time and that her talent was mediocre. The legendary staircase scene, where Wendy climbs up crying, while swinging a baseball bat is today a Guinness World Record of cruelty. Kubrick forced Duvall to repeat it 127 times. By the end of the day, the actress's hands were raw from clutching the bat, and she had lost her voice from screaming so much. Her eyes were permanently red from real crying. The stress was so devastating that her body began to fail. Her hair fell out in clumps. Months later, upon finishing production, Duvall handed Kubrick a bag with her own hair so he could see, physically, the damage he had caused her. But the torture was not only psychological. Due to post-traumatic stress, Duvall developed a severe physical anxiety condition with chronic panic attacks and asthma. Her body could no longer distinguish between the terror of the script and the reality of the set. Kubrick, far from taking pity, took advantage of her crises to film, saying that state gave the movie the right look. Even the veterans suffered. Scatman Crothers, who played the cook, nearly collapsed at 70 years old when Kubrick forced him to repeat a dialogue take 148 times. The actor ended up crying out of pure frustration and exhaustion, screaming in despair. It was at that moment when Jack Nicholson himself, who usually endured the director's rhythm, had to physically intervene to demand Kubrick stop being so cruel to the old man. Even the set seemed to rebel. The gigantic stage of the Overlook Hotel ended up in flames due to the heat of the spotlights. The most disturbing thing is a photo from that moment. While the set was being reduced to ashes and the crew ran in desperation, Kubrick is seen sitting in front of the ruins, laughing. The fact that Shelley Duvall was nominated for Worst Actress is a reason to close down that disgusting institution, and it reminds us that the press, the media, and now social networks are nothing but soulless trash. The Shining is a masterpiece, but the price was the mental health of a woman who received inhumane treatment. Surprisingly, the actress did not hold a grudge against Stanley Kubrick, nor did she regret it. As Duvall herself said years later, "I wouldn't trade it for anything, but I wouldn't do it again for all the money in the world." If you thought the lions were crazy, what Jim Caviezel experienced on the set of The Passion of the Christ borders on sadistic. Mel Gibson wasn't looking for an artistic representation. He was looking for a visceral realism that almost cost his protagonist his life. Caviezel didn't have to act the pain. He lived it in every second of footage. During the famous scourging scene, the realism got out of hand. The Roman soldiers were supposed to hit a protective post, but on 2 occasions, the whip hit Caviezel's back directly. The result was a 14-inch open wound and a systemic shock that left him breathless. But that was only the beginning. The filming took place in the middle of the Italian winter, with sub-zero temperatures. Caviezel spent hours nearly naked, hanging on the cross, suffering from severe hypothermia that prevented him from speaking. His body was so at the limit that he developed a lung infection and pneumonia that almost killed him. However, the most surreal and terrifying moment occurred during the Sermon on the Mount. Lightning struck Caviezel directly, charring part of his hair and exiting through his fingers. The most incredible part is that the lightning didn't just hit him, but also the assistant director, Jan Michelini, for the second time in the same shoot. The crew described seeing Caviezel lit up like a light bulb before falling to the ground. By the end of the film, Caviezel's body was wrecked. He suffered a shoulder dislocation from carrying the 70-kilogram cross, deep cuts, hypothermia, and finally had to undergo open heart surgery due to the extreme physical stress he was subjected to. The actor has confessed that during the shoot, he felt mystical experiences related to God and Jesus Christ, and that it changed his life, reaffirming his faith and convictions. We reach the most tragic spot, as the filming of Stalker cost the lives of director Andrei Tarkovsky, his wife Larisa Tarkovskaya, and the leading actor Anatoly Solonitsyn. They didn't die on set, but the set is what killed them. The filming had to move to Estonia, near Tallinn, after an earthquake destroyed the original location in Tajikistan. Tarkovsky found what seemed like the perfect setting for a post-apocalyptic zone: an abandoned hydroelectric plant and an old chemical factory. But it was the biggest mistake of his life. The crew spent months filming in the river that passed next to the factory. The water was contaminated with lethal chemical waste from a cellulose plant located upstream. In several shots of the film, a thick white foam can be seen floating in the water. Those weren't special effects. They were real toxic residues that the crew breathed and touched daily. It even snowed white chemical dust during the shoot. The consequences were devastating and silent. A few years after finishing the film, the lead actor, Anatoly Solonitsyn, died of lung cancer. In 1986, Andrei Tarkovsky himself also died of lung cancer at 54. and a few years later, his wife, Larisa Tarkovskaya, also died of lung cancer. The problem wasn't just the extremely toxic and contaminated environment, but that the entire shoot was an absolute disaster that dragged the process out much longer than planned. Tarkovsky filmed for an entire year using a new experimental film from Kodak, 5247. When they sent the negatives to Moscow to be developed, the entire film came out black. They had been burned, or the laboratory made a catastrophic error. A year of work and millions of rubles were lost. Tarkovsky suffered a nervous breakdown, but instead of giving up, he decided to reshoot the film from scratch in the same toxic place, condemning the crew to a second year of chemical exposure. The shoot was so tense that the original cinematographer resigned after a violent fight with Tarkovsky, and due to an outbreak of extreme stress, Andrei suffered a heart attack shortly after finishing the filming, which weakened his health years before the cancer appeared. Stalker is not just a science fiction masterpiece, it is the testament of a crew that gave their lives, literally, for the vision of a director who would not take no for an answer. There is a famous scene where a calendar is seen in the water. The date that remains visible is April 26th, the same day that the Chernobyl disaster would occur 7 years later. An extraordinary omen that solidifies this shoot as a tragic and legendary milestone. Aguirre, The Wrath of God, is probably the most extreme film shoot in history. Werner Herzog decided that the only way to film madness was to submerge himself in it. He took 450 people into the deepest part of the Amazon without doctors, without hotels, and with a camera he himself had stolen from a film school in Munich. If a snake bit you, you were dead. There was no contact with the outside world. They ate rice with worms and whatever they could hunt, but the real danger wasn't the jungle. It was the psychopath Klaus Kinski. On one occasion, the actor, annoyed by the noise the extras were making while playing cards in a cabin, grabbed a Winchester and fired 3 times at the wall. One of the shots blew off the tip of an extra's finger. It was a miracle there wasn't a massacre. Herzog, instead of stopping the shoot, simply confiscated the weapon and kept filming. But the legendary moment occurred when Klaus Kinski, fed up with the extreme conditions, threatened to leave the shoot. Herzog knew that if his star left, the movie died. According to legend, confirmed by the director himself, Herzog approached Klaus with a pistol and told him with total calm, "I have a rifle. If you leave, you will receive 8 bullets in the head, and the 9th will be for me." Kinski, who was a maniac but not an idiot, saw Herzog's eyes and knew he wasn't joking. He finished the film under a real death threat. In one scene, the rafts get caught in a giant whirlpool. That wasn't in the script. The rafts really got stuck in a zone of dangerous currents for days. Herzog, instead of asking for an immediate rescue, took the opportunity to keep filming the real panic of the actors. In the end, they had to be rescued by local indigenous people who knew the river, but they were on the verge of drowning or being smashed against the rocks. And to close this story comes the final madness. For the end of the movie, Herzog needed hundreds of monkeys. He bought 400 squirrel monkeys from local traffickers. The problem was that the monkeys started biting everyone and escaping around the boat. Klaus, in one of his outbursts, tried to kill several of them. Herzog finished the shoot alone with a camera in hand, surrounded by monkeys urinating on him, and an actor who no longer knew if he was an actor or Aguirre himself. This shoot marked a before and after in film history. Nothing so extreme had ever been done to film a work. And this is what inspired Apocalypse Now. What was supposed to be a 4-month shoot in the jungles of the Philippines turned into a civil war of nearly 2 years. Francis Ford Coppola not only risked his career, but his mental health and his entire personal fortune on a project that seemed destined for total disaster. To start, Coppola reached an agreement with the dictator Ferdinand Marcos to use real military helicopters from the Philippine army. The problem was that the country was in the middle of a civil war against rebel guerrillas. In the middle of a take, the pilots would receive orders over the radio and abandon the set with the armed helicopters to go fight and bomb communist rebels a few kilometers away. The actors watched as the war machines moved away from fiction into real combat, and how they returned with blood and bullet holes. But if the environment was a war, the set was an asylum. Dennis Hopper was constantly consuming drugs and suffering psychotic outbreaks, and the original protagonist, Harvey Keitel, was fired after a few weeks. He was replaced by Martin Sheen, who arrived on set in a terrible physical and mental state. In the famous opening hotel scene, Sheen was actually drunk. In a fit of self-hatred, he punched a real mirror, cut his hand, and covered in blood, tried to attack the director. Coppola, instead of stopping, kept filming the nervous breakdown of his actor. Shortly after, due to extreme heat and the consumption of alcohol and drugs, Sheen suffered a massive heart attack in the middle of the jungle. He had to crawl for a kilometer to ask for help and received the last rites in a field hospital. When Coppola found out, he suffered an epileptic seizure. He forbade the word heart attack from being used in any official communication. The version they sent to the press and the studio was that Sheen had severe heat exhaustion, all to prevent the shoot from being cancelled. But the weather was not more merciful. Typhoon Olga wiped out all the film sets, destroying millions of dollars in decor and leaving the crew trapped in the mud for weeks. Coppola, on the brink of bankruptcy and having mortgaged his properties to finish the film, suffered a nervous breakdown and threatened to commit suicide on 3 different occasions. He lost 45 kilograms during the process. The chaos reached its peak with the arrival of Marlon Brando. He was paid $1 million in advance, but arrived on set severely overweight, over 130 kilograms, when his character was supposed to be a gaunt soldier, and without having read a single page of the script. Coppola had to film him almost always in shadows to hide his belly, and spend entire days reading the book aloud to him, while Brando improvised incoherent dialogue. But the most macabre part, which almost no one knows, is that in some of the scenes, real human corpses were used. The prop master bought them from a supplier who turned out to be a grave robber. The Philippine police intervened on the set, confiscated the bodies, and held the passports of the entire crew until the origin of the deceased was cleared up. At the climax of the film, a water buffalo is seen being sacrificed with machetes by a local tribe. Coppola filmed a real ritual sacrifice. The Ifugao tribe, who worked as extras, were going to kill the animal anyway for a ceremony, and Coppola decided to set up the cameras. It was an authentic butchery that today would cause the immediate closure of any studio for animal abuse. And for good reason. In the end, he gave birth to a masterpiece, but the price was burning an entire production alive. As Coppola himself said when presenting it, "My movie is not about Vietnam. My movie is Vietnam." We reach number 1 with the definitive madness of Werner Herzog and Klaus Kinski, Fitzcarraldo. Here we aren't talking about an extreme shoot, we're talking about a civil war with arrow attacks, chainsaw amputations, and a real offer of assassination. The premise was that a man had to pull a steamboat over a mountain. Any sane director would have used models, but Herzog didn't. He built 3 identical boats, and the main one, weighing 320 tons, was dragged up the mountain by hundreds of indigenous people, using only pulleys and brute force. The chief engineer resigned in terror. This isn't cinema, it's mass murder. If a cable breaks, the pulleys will cut 50 people in half. Herzog ignored the warning and pushed forward. The filming took place in a border zone between Peru and Ecuador, in the middle of an armed conflict. The first camp was set on fire by local tribes, and 2 workers were hit by arrows, one in the throat and his wife in the abdomen. Both survived by a miracle after emergency surgeries in the middle of the jungle. But the horror didn't end there. An extra was bitten by a lethal snake, and knowing that gangrene would kill him in hours, he amputated his own foot with a chainsaw right there to stop the venom. Originally, the protagonists were Jason Robards and Mick Jagger. After filming 40%, Robards contracted dysentery, and Jagger went on tour with the Stones. Herzog, instead of giving up, burned all the footage and called his dear enemy, Klaus Kinski. The budget doubled, and Herzog's mental health fractured. Kinski's fury on set was so unbearable that the chiefs of the Mashigenga tribe approached Herzog with total seriousness and proposed murdering the actor. Herzog, although he hated him, rejected the offer because he needed to finish the film, but admitted it was a real temptation. The final challenge was the engineering of death, pushing the boat up a 40-degree slope. The risk of the cables decapitating the dozens of men pushing was constant. There were terrible accidents. One worker was crushed to death, a photographer broke his ribs, and a small plane crashed, leaving several members with permanent paralysis. In the end, the boat went up the mountain, but Herzog admitted the shoot had stolen his soul. His words upon finishing were, "I shouldn't have made this movie. I should be in a psychiatric hospital." And he is absolutely right. If you enjoyed this descent into the hell of the 7th art, subscribe and tell me in the comments. Do you think a masterpiece justifies putting human lives at risk? Or should these directors have ended up in prison?